All right, everybody. Hello, my name is Megan Batchelor. I am the membership manager for WFAE. I want to thank you all for joining us for the Podcast Festival pop-up, as well as this afternoon's session, Real Talk. We're going to jump into covering difficult conversations through podcasting. We will be joined by the hosts of We Live Here and Code Switch. I do want to thank our Podcast Festival pop-up sponsor, Ortho Carolina, as well as our partners, Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, and Eclex Creative Agency. Just a few notes of housekeeping before we jump into it. Please use the chat feature. All of our podcast festival attendees, podcasters, podcast fans, to introduce yourselves, introduce your podcasts. WFAE moderators will be sharing links and information throughout the session. But if you have questions for our hosts, our panel, please use the Q&A feature to ask those questions. And just, of course, a reminder that the only way WFAE is able to bring you the Podcast Festival for free and provide news, information, and podcasts from WFAE is through member support. So I hope you'll take a moment during the giving season to join WFAE with a contribution at WFAE.org. We also have a Venmo if you would like to leave us a tip during the Podcast Festival. You can find us at WFAE Radio. Without any further ado, I am thrilled and honored to introduce award-winning journalist, educator, columnist, and host of the Equal Time podcast with Roll Call, a contributor to more news outlets and educational projects than I can count, Charlotte's Mary C. Curtis. Hi, Mary.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for that introduction. I am very excited to moderate this panel, which is called Real Talk, Tackling the Tough Topics. And we know in today's fraught world, even things you may not think are controversial or tough topics, well, such as a pandemic, well, they are. But yet we have so many people with important things to say, including all our listeners today. And this panel might help provide a roadmap. So our panelists are, we'll hear from We Live Here's Lauren Brown. She's out of Chicago today. She's very well known for her work on the documentary Black at Mizzou, Confronting Race on Campus, produced with American Public Media. It's wonderful. I really would encourage you to listen. Her team won a 2021 National Edward R. Murrow and 2020 Education Writers Association Award for it. Check it out. And her work with the We Live Here podcast has covered such topics as environmental racism and Black mental health. We also have from Cambridge, where she was a Neiman Fellow, and I was one once. I'm hoping she's having some fun at Harvard, is Shereen Marisol Meraji. She's joining us there. From there, she is an audio producer and reporter who's told stories with sound for 20 years, hard to believe. Most recently as the co-host of NPR's critically acclaimed Code Switch podcast. Another one I've actually written for them. It's a wonderful podcast. And as a founding member of the Code Switch team, she's reported on issues of race, racism, and racial identity formation since 2013. And in 2020, Apple Podcasts named Code Switch its first ever podcast of the year. And she says that although she's worked for NPR for much of her career, Shereen says she grew up in a Puerto Rican and Iranian home where no one spoke in hushed tones and where the rhythms and cadences of life inspired her story pitches and storytelling style. And I think, first of all, that's an important lesson from both Lauren and Shereen, to bring your authentic self and lived experience to your work, and it will come through in the podcast. Certainly it has for me. I'm Mary C. Curtis, and in Equal Time with Mary C. Curtis, which covers politics and policy through a social justice lens. And we hit so many topics from voting rights to inequities and everything from housing to healthcare. I am still that little Black girl who grew up in West Baltimore in a raucous household with 5 kids, 2 parents, a boarder, and friends coming and going, developing curiosity about everything. Mm-hmm. So to get right to it, I've listened to both of your work, but perhaps some of our listeners are not familiar with some of it. So if you could briefly share, what is the mission and goal of your podcast? And how did you come to see a void and create something new to fill it in the conversation? Lauren, I wonder if you could start.
Yes. So like Mary said, I'm the former host of the We Live Here podcast out of St. Louis Public Radio. Initially, the podcast started after the Ferguson uprising. The newsroom felt like they had a gap in coverage and they wanted to take a deeper look into parts of the community that wasn't being covered. And so it went through a cycle of different hosts. We had Tim Lloyd and Camille Stanley. She's went on to USA Today and things like that. And then I came on in 2019. And so the podcast digs deep into topics about race and class, whether it was, big topics, whether deciding merging St. Louis City and St. Louis County and how, Black voters would lose a lot of political power, talking about environmental racism, food deserts, food apartheid, and then also talking about Black mental health and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected, disproportionately affected African Americans. And so the podcast really takes a deep dive, even investigative accountability pieces, things like that, going into different neighborhoods and, sometimes being able to have the EPA come out, being able to have their soil tested, things like that. But taking those deep dives into topics that, directly affect communities of color.
Great. How about you, Shereen?
So Code Switch actually wasn't a podcast when we started. We had a blog, and then we had various audio producers and reporters who were making stories for NPR's bigger shows, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and we were created in that vein to talk about race, racial justice issues, racism, and for the network. And what we realized was that doing that work, especially doing it in 4.5 minutes or 8 minutes if you're lucky on the radio, for All Things Considered in Morning Edition, it just, we didn't have the ability to go into the kind of depth that we wanted to go into, and to give the context for our audience that we felt was necessary when we were talking about these issues. And so after a lot of deliberation and a lot of pleading with folks at NPR, we said, I think that this would be better in a podcast form where we had more time to talk about these issues in a much more nuanced way, and not in a surface way, because that's what you're doing when you have 3.5 minutes on the radio. You're only talking about maybe the event itself, but not all of the history that led up to it, for example. And so, so we launched the podcast, the Code Switch podcast, in May of 2016. And there's just one anecdote I'd like to share, and it actually is connected to the Ferguson uprising. We did not have the podcast at that time. There was no Code Switch podcast. So I was the radio producer who was on the ground in Ferguson, who was covering the uprising. And we I was assigned, it was the day after the grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson, who was the officer who killed Michael Brown, for people who may not remember what happened in Ferguson. And there was unrest because of that decision. And I was the reporter on the ground who got the assignment to cover the destruction that happened the night before in the next morning. And so that was my assignment, and that's what I had to do. And so what I did was I had 4 minutes to tell the story, and I made sure that I ended the story with a protester who was out in front of what was it? It was a Little Caesars Pizza that burned down. I don't know if you remember this, Lauren, but there was a Little Caesars Pizza, and there are a lot of people talking about the destruction. And he was there, and he was like, this is not about the destruction that happened last night. This is so much deeper than that. This is about anti-Black racism that has been going on for centuries, and to just focus on things being broken and windows being broken and not talking about why they're being broken is ridiculous. And so he said this to me, and I was like, this is what we're ending this with. Even though this was my assignment, I'm ending it with his voice and that context. And I got a tweet that someone tweeted at me and said, hey, why did you not talk to any protesters for this, 3-minute story that you did? And I said, what are you talking about? I ended with one of the most powerful voices in all my stories. I went back and listened to All Things Considered, and they cut him out of the story because they were doing an update where Eric Holder was doing something live. They cut him out of the story, and then they just left business owners who were talking about their businesses that had broken windows, et cetera. And that's when, for me, I was like, I can't have this happen anymore. We have to have our own space to talk about these stories, to give the context, to give the depth, to give the nuance. And that's what the podcast was. And I never had to tell a story like that again in that way, and be subjected to it, the most important part of it being cut out. Sorry, that was really long.
No, that was a wonderful anecdote, because
Mhm.
I think a lot of our listeners are saying, I have an important story to tell that's not being told. I wonder, Lauren, if you can give an example of perhaps some challenges you have faced in trying to tell the stories you think have to be told and how you overcame them.
Yes. So when I think about that question, I think about the Black at Mizzou doc specifically, because originally I was just assigned as a freelancer. I was just supposed to help do a couple of interviews, things like that, very, very basic. And we took a trip back to Mizzou. And so I started talking about my experience there and some things that I saw and how it impacted my life. And the producers were like, did you ever think about telling your story? And I said, oh, no, not really. Just want to support and make sure that I get, the main people who are on the ground doing the work, their story. And so we talked about it, and I really thought about how important it was for me specifically, and how that story is the same story as other Black students at Mizzou, and that story has never been told. And so I really took a leap of faith, being a journalist, but also being a character in the documentary. And then at the same time, working on We Live Here. And so it was very difficult mentally to talk about a lot of the struggles that Black women and Black people face every day, and then having to tell my story within that, but also having to be able to, be a journalist and be objective and tell a story. And so it was very hard, but I think that at the end of the day, it made for a better story because I was able to be vulnerable, authentic. I was able to show that even though we did deal with these things, it was some beauty in the end of it all. It was some, we built a family, we built a culture. And so I think that really made for a great story. And a lot of students that reach out to me would say, I'm so happy you were able to show, Black Mizzou, our culture, our school, what we did and how we felt about each other, and not just about, those incidents and what, larger news outlets were doing to the story. And so I think that is something that I really hold near and dear to my heart. And I think that being able to have the opportunity to do that I'm very grateful to have that opportunity. And I think being able to open the floor and open the door for other Black journalists to do the same thing is very important for the next generation.
Definitely. And from listening to it, that message really came through. I do want to ask both of you, because in both cases, you're telling stories that perhaps have not been told and maybe go against sort of conventional wisdom of folks who are going to say, Shereen, cut that piece off of yours. So I wanted to ask both of you, how did you get support for this vision, for this goal? And how do you draw listeners and support when everybody seems to be choosing sides? Shereen.
How did we get support? I think that in the beginning, it was, we'll let you all try this and see how it goes. There wasn't necessarily a groundswell of resources and support for the podcast specifically. I think there was okay, let's wait and see if this gets an audience, and you can grow this on your own, and then maybe we'll give you some more support. So, and we did that, and actually I think that more support came after um the the reignition of the movement for Black Lives after George Floyd. I mean, I think because the podcast became quite popular then, and then I think NPR really took notice then, like, oh, this is something special that we have. And the thing about it is that it's been they've been doing this work and talking about these issues for the last 5 years. They're not like new on the scene all of a sudden, and they were like, "Ooh, good thing we had that. Let's, let's give a little bit more support to it." I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, you feel the need that even they didn't know they had, right?
Yeah, right.
And then the news
And
events.
they're like, "Whoa,
yeah, overtook
maybe we
it.
should be listening to this podcast."
Yeah, how about you, Lauren? I know you felt isolated, first on the campus. How did you get support? And also, how do you engage listeners when, people are picking sides and they already are so hardened and doubling down on maybe, against the tales that you were trying to tell?
I think for the documentary, I actually got a lot of support from APN specifically. And that was very shocking to me, just being a journalist of color and having to work on stories as the only journalist of color and talking about issues that we face with the team of, all white producers that may not understand from the same lens. But I think that because I was so open to it and they gave me that encouragement and that power, I think it just helped the story and it helped us hone in on what we really wanted to tell. Before we live here, I came into something that was already established. The podcast already had hosts, it already had, accolades and things. So I had to learn how to maintain, but also grow a new audience. And I think for me, my specific niche or, something that's very, very important to me is to have the voices of the people. And so I think that, having investigative accountability pieces are very important, but also the people have something to say. And if we don't go into those places and spaces that people are afraid of, or people feel like, they have to parachute in and do stories like that. But being on the ground, going to community events, being there, showing your face, letting people know who you are and that their story matters is how you get more listeners and how you get people to appreciate the work that you're doing. And I think that, having that open line of communication for the community where they feel like they can come and, send me press releases or tell me about a story, or just, just walking in the store and then somebody asks me, what do I do? And I say, oh, I work for We Live Here. And I love that podcast. I love that show. I want to tell you about this. And sometimes you just learn things like that. You can find a new story idea just through conversations. And so I think being able to have something that people can see themselves in is always very appreciative, and you'll always have support and you'll always gain more support when you're catering to, the people that need it the most.
Yeah, I really hear you, and I appreciate. I know from listening to some of your podcasts, you've been in indigenous communities all over just to get those voices. And I'm sorry, Shereen, you were going to.
Oh no, I just wanted to
Yes.
say I think that's exactly right. I mean, even though we weren't getting the monetary support and the resources necessarily from NPR, because we were doing exactly what Lauren was saying, we were representing people and communities that had not seen themselves represented at all in quote unquote mainstream media. They were like, oh, okay, I see myself here. I want to support this. And so that's where our support came from. And we grew that by being who we were, representing communities that were underrepresented. And when the time came, we were there telling the stories that we had been telling for 5 years. So people trusted us. And, and then the monetary support and resources came.
Followed. Yeah, I like to say I am sort of the audience in a sense of I'm so curious about things. I try to ask questions that anybody would ask about things that they just, what am I curious about? What do I want to know? Who do I want to speak with? I wanted to ask really a question maybe that some of our listeners might be thinking who have this idea, but how do you keep your vision on that North Star of what your goal is when it looks like nobody is out there saying the things you want to say? How did you keep that motivation to tell that story, that tough topic, and tackle it when it seemed seemingly nobody else was doing it. Either one, Lauren?
I think for me, I think my passion drives me every day. I think because I find value in it and I know that people around me find value in it. I know that my family has dealt with these things. I know that, those stories are important. I think that drives me to continue to do and to continue to do the work every day. Everybody might not see your vision, but if you have a vision and you have a brand and you have a goal, go after it. Be determined, work hard for it. And I think just being able to say, I think about my ancestry a lot. I think about my grandmother a lot and stories she's told me and how I've always loved stories and storytelling and being a part of history and making sure that those stories are told. A lot of times, stories get lost. But I think being able to have that passion and that drive and that focus kind of helps you in those times where you feel, oh, I might not have this or I might not have that, but it's someone out there that enjoys what you do. And eventually you're going to see them, they're going to show up. And I think a lot of times I thought, oh, this episode, maybe it doesn't get as many, downloads or listens. And man, I wish I could have did this here. And then someone DMs me or someone comments on it and says, I love that episode. I love that you did that. Nobody else talks about this but you all, but this show. And so I think it's important for you to always believe in yourself, believe in your craft, and just have that passion and that drive and work hard for it. And the support, like Shereen said, will come. The monetary stuff will come, but being able to work hard at it is what I think gets you where you need to go.
I see you nodding, Shereen. Do you have something to add to that?
I think that for Code Switch, and when we were creating Code Switch, the thing that kept us going when we weren't getting maybe as much institutional support as we wanted was keeping in constant communication with our audience, whether that was through social media or, yeah, it was basically through social media, and also asking our audience, hey, what are you interested in? What do you want to hear? What are questions that you have that we can answer for you? And knowing that there were people out there who were really hungry for what it is that we were trying to do. And I think what we were trying to do too, there was an additional challenge because we were trying to talk about race beyond black and white and trying to like bring in various multiracial identities and like make this like a cross-racial conversation and bring in, what is race? What is ethnicity? How are we all raced differently? And that was something that was new in the podcast space, like talking about race across race, talking about race beyond the black and white binary in the United States, and what that meant. And so I think the way that we handled those challenges and being in this kind of new territory was just being in constant conversation with our listeners, asking them, did we do this wrong? How could we do it better? We got a lot of feedback about how we weren't doing a good enough job representing Indigenous issues and Indigenous communities. And so we tried to shift and do that better, and then continuously ask our audience, okay, what more? How can we do this more? And I think that is what kept us motivated to keep going every single week. It definitely kept me motivated.
Well, what is the biggest challenge in this process that you have faced, and how did you figure out a way to overcome it as you're going along this process and developing your shows? Is there something
I
that
mean, I
really
think what Lauren said is on point. Like there are certain things where it's a really, really important issue, but for some reason it didn't get traction. And to know that doesn't mean it doesn't have a long tail. For example, like there will be things that people will listen to years after we put it out, and maybe the week that we put it out, it wasn't the hottest thing and it didn't get the most downloads. So to not get caught up too much in immediate downloads and what's popular in the moment and those types of challenges. I think that was really hard for us. Also because an audience gets used to hearing stories presented in a certain way. And so then they're attracted to those stories that are presented in that way. And if you're doing something different, it takes a minute for the audience to catch on, or, um, they think they want something and you give them something else. And at first maybe they're a bit put off by it or whatever. And we all know, because we're all in the media, what sells: crime and entertainment. And if you're not doing, that's what's going to get the most downloads, that's what's going to get people attracted to it right away. And that's not what we're doing. And so just to be patient, know that the audience is there, know that there's a long tail for a lot of these things, and they stay up in the world and they're there for a really long time to educate people. That's really important. And just to know that the audience is going to come, they are going to find you. But did that answer your question, Mary? I just
no, it does. It does.
I
Before I ask the next one, I just want to remind folks, if you have a question for our incredible panelists, please put it in the Q&A. And I want to ask, is there a topic that you really wanted to do that you haven't quite figured out a way to approach it yet, and you're still working on it, sort of your dream or something out there, but you still are trying to figure out how to approach it? Anything?
Yes, but yes, it's something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I think after doing the Black at Mizzou doc, I really got excited about it. I really want to do it. It's very personal to me. And I think that that's the reason why it's hard to figure out, how I want to do it, which way to go, but definitely something, I don't know if I want to say.
Ooh, now you've got us all intrigued. That's called a cliffhanger. I think that's a good.
But there's something for sure.
Yeah.
Yes. A
Okay,
passion
you're not
project.
going to tell us, huh?
A passion project for sure.
Okay. Okay, you'll let us know when you've got it, right? So we'll, okay. Lauren's keeping it close to the vest.
I
How
like
about
it.
you, Shereen?
So right now, one thing that I talked about a lot on Code Switch was the fact that my father's from Iran, my mom is from Puerto Rico, and I was not raised speaking my heritage languages. I was raised speaking English, and how not having a connection and not being proficient in my heritage languages really has affected my identity and how I feel about who I am and where I fit in and all of those things. And Code Switch has been this journey of kind of trying to figure out where I fit into the racial puzzle of the United States of America. Anyway, all that said, I'm here at Neiman, and I've been doing something that I've been threatening to do my entire life, which is finally learn Spanish and learn it in a way that I feel like I can be confident in my abilities. So I'm taking a Spanish for Heritage Learners course, and I've been documenting that. And the thing that's really interesting about the course and being in it is that I am surrounded by other Latinos who also do not speak their heritage language, who also have all of these questions about their identity and who they are, and if it's okay for them to say they're Latinx if they don't speak Spanish. And I'm in a course with someone who's undocumented, whose parents brought him here when he was a baby, and he doesn't feel confident in the language of the country where he's from, but he's here, and he's undocumented. So there's all of these questions about identity and belonging that are coming up with all of us who are finally learning our heritage language, and all the reasons why our parents didn't teach us. And so much of that has to do with race, and so much of that has to do with discrimination and racism in this country. So anyway, all that to say, I've been documenting my progress and my process, and I hope that it will become a story with all of these other voices of other people who have gone back to try and figure out how to speak the language from their ancestors.
Yeah.
Well, what's
Mine
the
has to
latest
do with
census?
family as well.
I'm
Oh, yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. I was
It
just saying
does?
mine has to
Oh,
do with
wow.
family and heritage and stuff as well.
I'm going to take some tips there. And with the latest census showing the increase in the amount of Americans that identify as multiracial, that is only going to be a story that hits home for so many people. We do
Right.
have a question here. Thank you so much for being here. And question for both of you. The support for racial justice and equity has declined, particularly in white communities. When issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion go down, when the trending thing is over, how do you keep folks motivated to care about these issues? I am asking not just as a resident of Charlotte, but also as a person who works in the DEI space. Getting people to care this year the way they did last May has been increasingly difficult. Very on point question. Any tips for our listener?
That is a really hard question to answer. This was something that we talked about on the Code Switch podcast as well. We showed there have been surveys that show that there has been a decline in specifically white support for racial justice issues. And, you know, Code Switch was not actually, Code Switch was created to center listeners of color who have not had media and representation in the media centered on them. And so
Mhm.
it's hard for me to answer this question for like what white people should do or how to motivate white people to be more involved in racial justice issues, because I do feel like the white listeners to Code Switch, they're involved and they will continue to be involved. And the way that we see our audience, they're not the primary audience and they understand that. And so they're already doing it, just by listening
Yeah.
to Code Switch. It's part of how they do it. This is it's such a, one thing I would say is like, this is for everyone. This benefits all of us. This is not something that just is a benefit to communities of color, Black and Indigenous communities. This is something for all of us as a society to make us a better society. And, that's how I think we should look at racial justice issues, as something for all of us, if
Yeah.
to want.
Yeah. If you're preaching to the choir, how do you get those other folks to listen in? Lauren, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like you said, we live here. The audience is centered on, folks who don't often get their stories told. But even when I would go out, we had a lot of white listeners. And I think that, it's great that they're engaging, that they're listening, that they want to know, that they want to be involved, that they want to support. But I think continuing to put the stories out, continuing to show that these stories need to be told and not stopping just because, oh, it's not hot right now. But it's like these issues have always been there. These issues are continuing. These issues aren't going anywhere as we see it now. So continuing to tell those stories and not be afraid and not say, oh, let's have a pivot or direct it somewhere else, but to continue to put out those shows, continue to put out those episodes, and hopefully, we gain more listeners and more support. But I think that continuing to do the work and not just stopping and saying, okay, let's just throw all of that out the window, but continuing to do it.
It's just
Yeah.
such a hard question to answer, It's like,
Yeah.
because there have been ebbs and flows in support for over the years. And Mary, you know this. Actually, Mary, maybe you have a better answer than we do.
Well, I do think both of you, though, are saying one way, too, is to tell a story, a big story through the stories of individuals, because people can
Yeah.
always, when you go and talk to people, and you've both talked about that, going into communities, people can see themselves in it. So many things are universal, and people tend to think, oh, that goes on here and there. And sometimes some of the most heartfelt responses I have gotten is when, if I mention that, I have three, I'm the youngest of five, and my three older siblings were involved in the civil rights movement. And I had a brother that was arrested twice in sit-ins. And people will say, well, you're not that old. And I'll say, yeah, because it wasn't that long ago. And as you just said, Lauren, that these things have been happening through history. If you can connect the dots, my son's a historian, and he says, with progress always comes pushback, and let people sit themselves into the history of America, that this isn't, and that if you tell the stories through human beings, through people, whether I'm interviewing, someone who was affected by racial injustice or people who are in Confederate heritage groups, which I have done, if you tell it through those people, someone can say, oh, wow, okay, that's something that is in common with me. So that's one way. We have some great questions here. One, any tips for reaching out to marginalized communities who may be rightfully hesitant to trust media? Specifically, they say Indigenous people, but I guess this would be the case of anybody who is mistrustful and you want to get to talk with them to get their authentic voice in the story. Any tips?
One tip is there are media associations that are specific to different groups. So if you really want to get on the ground in certain Indigenous communities, you can go to the Native American Journalists Association and find people who can help you do that, and tell you ways in and things to do and things not to do. I mean, I think that there are guides that can help you in the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, for example, if you want to speak to Latinx communities and you're feeling like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. We'll ask people from these various associations how to do this in a respectful way, and how to go into communities where you feel like you might, people might, and rightly so, be a little bit wary of your presence. I think those are great resources, and the resources that I've used, especially if I'm going into the Native American community or telling a story that is a Native American story, and I need help, or I'm not sure if I'm using the right terminology, all of those things. So
Yeah. How about you, Lauren? Any tips?
Yeah. I would say the same things, and just being honest that I don't know everything, asking questions, making sure that I understand, and not just coming in and just being honest about the fact that I may not know it all, I may not know everything, but also not just parachuting into the communities when something happens. I think it's really hard to go and get a story when you're going there for that specific reason and you've never gone to this community before. I know when I was first a transplant to St. Louis, I used to go to different events just to go and just learn more about the community and be in the space, so that, when I did need to come and do a story, that I've been around, that people know me, that people trust me, and that they feel okay with me coming to tell their story. So I think building trust is also very important.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of good points. One is to admit what you don't know. And I have done that on a story on the transgender community, which I would think, if I make a mistake, just let me know. And the other, which is very important, is the whole thing of parachuting into a community as though it's, another planet, just when there's a story you want to get. You have to go out, have lunch, walk around, look at the community. I remember when I grew up in Baltimore, and when the Freddie Gray situation happened, and so many news organizations came in to do a story. They wanted the picture of the burning CVS, and then they wanted to leave. And I knew that as a person who grew up there, they were missing out on the community center library across the street that stayed open, which where I got my library card, and they didn't stay to see the community clean up and all these other things. And you can see where folks would feel that the community wasn't telling their story. So when people came in, they wouldn't talk with them. The people ask, where do you get your sources? Well, have you been in there when you're not trying to get the story of the minute? Yep. So both of those are very good tips.
Yep.
That's really true. I covered Freddie Gray, and the only reason why I got in to do this, one of the stories that I got, was because I had been there before doing other stories. So I had connections in West Baltimore. And then I met a principal, and I got to stay with her all day when kids came back to school for the very first day of school, but that would never have happened if I hadn't done stories in West Baltimore before.
Oh, yeah. If you only thought of it as like, that's The Wire, no.
You're right. Right.
We have some great questions coming in from Daniel Walker asks, have either of you faced being shut down on a direction you wanted your respective podcast with a particular story or several stories? Or do your podcasts give you the freedom to direct it your way? A follow up or add on is, what do you do when a story goes to a place you're just not ready to go? Or are the stories just so organic that you ride the wave? You apologize for the long question. You don't have to, Daniel. These are some intriguing questions.
The great thing about Code Switch was we had the space to tell stories the way we wanted to tell them, and nobody was paying attention to us from big bosses. And so we kind of got to do what we wanted to do and figure out our lens and our voice. And that was what was so exciting. Now, when I was doing stories for NPR and I didn't have the podcast, yeah, there were so many times where I was told that how I think that one of the things that I would hear a lot is like, how is this relevant to a broader audience? Or why should we care about this thing? I mean, things have really changed in the last 5 years so much. But yeah, why? I mean, I'm talking about, for example, especially if I ever wanted to cover hip hop. Now, hip hop has been around for a very, very long time, but it's like, like it was some sort of niche thing that nobody like, why would our audience care about this? And it's just
because
like,
every white kid in the suburb is listening to it.
Exactly. But to answer your question about the podcast, we've been able to tell stories the way we want to tell them, and it was amazing. It was a dream come true, really.
The second part, has any of your shows sort of gone one way and you were looking for another? Did you organically just go with it?
I think I've organically went with it. I've probably been in tough situations where the conversation was just really tough with the individual, but I think making sure that it's conversational has always helped me in the end, for sure.
Can you give us that example?
Let's see. I think it depends on who you're talking to, like who your interviewee is. And sometimes going into interviews where this question is going to get them, or this question is something that they probably would rub them the wrong way, or they might not want to answer. Maybe it's someone of a power person, a politician, stuff like that. But being able to, I think for me, I always open up the floor with very welcoming questions, going in and just having regular conversation, finding different ways you can rephrase a question, you can come back to a question, you can do all these different things within the conversation to kind of help, get part of what you need or what you want to tell, but in different ways. So I think it's all about the planning and also the execution when you're doing the interview and who you're speaking with.
Yeah, start out with that nice, but also I would say do a ton of reporting beforehand. So you're familiar with the person and the issue. You don't want to go in to be caught by surprise. And if you can, even delve deeper, so you might know a little personal note about someone's hobby or something like that. I can tell you that really has opened up a lot of conversations that I've had. And as I said, I've interviewed folks who were singing Dixie. So, you have to go into a space and really talk with people and do that research ahead of time. Anytime you spend doing that beforehand will really pay off when you get to that conversation and you're not asking people, so tell me, what is it you do?
Yeah.
We have some great questions and also some compliments for all of you. Tesla asks, what advice would you give for a podcast that wants to tackle tough topics, but has to have approval from higher ups before talking about them? How would you approach topics and approach pitching them? Wow.
Oh, wait. Okay. Let me think about that one.
I'm sure you both have, with the topics that you cover, might have had trouble kind of selling them.
Higher ups before tackling. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Any thoughts on that? I know I get the same questions you do, Shereen, as far
Mhm.
as something I think is just so important, but someone will say, well, I don't see how that connects, or who will care about that? And I just try to keep making those connections to a bigger issue until they get it, until they see what I see.
But also, it's when they say, why would the audience care? Aren't we a part of aren't the people that we're trying to reach a part of the
Yes.
audience as well? Who is this audience that we're talking about here? Because everyone is a part of the audience. So this story will reach someone that's a part of this audience. So that I have a tough time with that question a lot when they ask, who's the audience? Why would the audience care? We're a part of the audience. All of these groups are a part of the audience. And so I think, pitching is a tough process, especially depending on what you're trying to pitch. But I think, like Mary said, just trying to get them to see what you see, to see your vision, to understand how you're trying to approach it and which way you want to go, and just making sure that you took a long time to think about this pitch before you go in and pitch it. That'll be very, very important for sure.
I think also having data is good.
Yeah.
Having numbers on your side.
Yeah. Mhm.
When especially at NPR, when I was pitching things from the Latino community, to be like, hey, and this is the second largest demographic in the United States, so we may want to tell stories that are about this community and that represent this community. That's always helpful to just have that in your back pocket.
Yeah.
Data is good. Good hard numbers, like how many people this actually affects, because they have a feeling, but you have the facts. And so to come correct with the facts and to have the data on your side and the numbers, and in our case, to tweet it out and just to be able to show how many people interacted with you just mentioning this idea or mentioning this topic, and like having it like be sparked like wildfire on social media, and just being able to show them, hey, this is interesting, this is something that's on people's minds. That's also helpful.
Oh, that's
It's
definitely
helpful.
true. I remember years ago, when Selena, the singer, died, and they were selling out newspapers and the podcast things.
Yes.
Well, it wasn't podcast at the time, radio. And there were some people who had some decision makers who had never heard of her. And it seems like since then, you always keep having to have these same examples, but
Right.
again and again, because, to make it sink in. We have some great questions. One, with you being so immersed in the stories of individuals and communities and issues that are human-centered, how do you balance your passion for this work without burning out? I ask this again from the lens of a DEI practitioner and struggling with burnout, especially these past 2 years. Let's say we're in a tough time. Thank you, it says, for considering this question.
Well,
Yes,
Mary, go ahead.
Go
Lauren.
ahead.
No, go.
Oh, I was just going to say,
Lauren.
I think it's you learn by the day. I don't know. For me, I think I've just learned that I need to take breaks. Even if it's 10 minutes, 15, 5. Just being able to have those mental health breaks, to have those breaks in that time away from all the things that you're working on or going through. But it definitely is really tough not to burn out when you're constantly trying to meet deadlines, or you're working on this, and then it's also this happening in the real world, but it's affecting you as well, and it's affecting someone in your family. And I think specifically like COVID was a really hard time. I lost a grandparent to COVID. I was away from home. I couldn't have conversations. I couldn't go and touch and hug and talk, but also having to put out stories about someone who's dealing with the same thing. And I think that's why it was important for me to take a deeper look into Black mental health and how mental health has been taboo in, communities of color, and the resources and, being able to say, I need help, I can't do it all, but being okay with that and to be okay with saying no when you have to. And I think it's just important to know when you need a break, and it's okay to say, I need a break. I need 5 minutes. Can I just step out? Can I, and just learning more about yourself and figuring out what can help you, what works for you, because everybody isn't the same. So figuring out what works best for you.
Thank you. And thank you. I'm so sorry about your grandparent,
Thank you.
Lauren. Shireen, did you have some suggestions?
I'm really bad at this, Mary. So do you have suggestions? I am actually very, very bad at this. I have put my personal well-being aside for work specifically, and that for a lot of years. I'm actually doing this fellowship because I'm on a fellowship right now, which is a break, and means it's been a hard break from the work that I'm doing, and I'm not going to be going back to code switch. I'm switching gears, but I was really bad at that. I was really bad at taking time for myself, taking care of myself, not working really long hours, not working every weekend, and it took a toll on me. My personal health, it's taken a toll on my personal relationships. I cannot lie, I have not figured out how to do this well. So, and this fellowship has been a healing moment for me, where I realized, oh my gosh, I was really exhausted. So Mary, I don't know if you have.
Well, no, I thank you for your honesty. I have that problem. I'm a workaholic, avowed, and I have had to be proactive about trying to do something about recognizing this is who I am. And like at night, my brain is still going with ideas. I have to have one of those little machines that have waves for me to stop thinking about it. I've had to be proactive about yoga, about massage, about other things, because I know that this work is important to me, and that I will always want to be doing this and having voices out there that perhaps have not been heard and listened to, which, like I said, was baked in me from a little girl. So I have had to actually say, okay, and you have to do something about it, because the alternative is to get burned out and not do it. And then what would happen? So I appreciate that question.
It's a really good question, and good luck to you,
it
because
really
you're
is.
doing really good work.
I want to ask all of you too, what lesson have you learned through the process of tackling these tough topics in your podcast that you wish you knew at the beginning?
For me, that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to say, one, getting to what Lauren said, hey, I don't know. I'm learning too, and I'm trying my very best, and to be upfront and honest with that, and to also just talk about the difficulties that I have in figuring out where I belong, what's going on in my life, and being honest with the audience. And it actually, I wish I would have known that earlier, because once I started doing that, the connection with the audience became so much stronger, and people, the work that I was doing specifically started to resonate much deeper with the listeners. So being vulnerable, I wish I knew earlier that I could be vulnerable and that it wouldn't backfire on me.
That takes a leap of faith, though. Lauren, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree with being vulnerable and being okay to show different parts of yourself. And also, I think for a long time, I always felt like, these conversations about race, these conversations about gender, all of these conversations are so hard that people aren't ready for the real conversations. But once I realized that, it's some people ready for the real conversations. It's people that are looking for the real conversations, and not all the fluff, and not all the, all of those stories that kind of go around it and, beat around the bush. But those stories that actually say, hey, this is happening, this is going on, you need to know about this, and not being afraid to say. Even for myself, in the documentary, I was crying, and that was like a real thing for me. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be everywhere. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe this. But then when I sat and thought about it, I was like, I wouldn't have had this opportunity to even have that conversation with this person who did something for me if it wasn't for this documentary, if it wasn't for this time that I would had to go back and have these conversations with folks, then I would have never been able to have that conversation. And so, being able to have that moment with myself and with that individual, but also to know that somebody else had to deal with that same thing and they're appreciative that you did that. And so I think for me, yeah, being vulnerable and, telling the story, the true story, in the end, it always works out for sure.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to give you a last question and then do a little announcement. I'll give you a second to think about it, which is, while I do the announcement, what question or that I haven't asked should I have, because you have something to say about it and you want to make sure our listeners get that message from you. You'll have a minute to think about it while I will make sure that folks who are tuned in to stay tuned for tonight's session, which is building your podcast through branding and marketing. It's at 6 p.m. And we know with millions of podcasts out there, how can you have yours break through and stand out, have a strong visual impact and create brand recognition with your podcasts with graphics, marketing, and more. So you'll learn best practices for building your brand with our marketing experts. You can register at charlottepodcastfestival.com. Remember, that's building your podcast through branding and marketing at 6 p.m. tonight. So now, after a pause for that message, and I've been to a couple of sessions, it's great. I want to come back for our close with our terrific panelists, Shereen, Marisol, Meraji, and Lauren Brown, on what is the message you want to leave with the listeners on Real Talk, tackling tough topics that perhaps I didn't get to.
I don't know if you missed anything. I think just something that I would want to share is that I know specifically for me, being a journalist of color has been very hard, dealing with different things, finding your way. But I think I would want younger journalists of color to know that there is a space for you, that there is a space for us. And, life comes with adversity, life comes with challenges and things, but, we're important just as everyone else. And I think just giving that person, the younger generation, that mentorship, courage, just giving them advice. It's been a lot of times I asked individuals for advice and it didn't seem like that's what they wanted to do. And that can shut someone down. That can shut someone's dreams and goals and aspirations down. And so I would just say finding someone that you can see yourself in, that is open to having conversations with you. And also for journalists that have been around for a while, reach back to the generations behind you. Lend down your hand to support them and, listen to some of their ideas. You may think it's not a good idea, but help support them in, building that idea and building that brand and seeing it through and how they can bring it to fruition. So I would just want to just give, advice, anything that anybody needs or wants to ask, I'm always available and open to that. And, I'm just excited for what's to come. And yeah, I'm so grateful for being able to be a part of this conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. You are so wise. Shereen.
I agree. Yes. I think that the one thing that I would leave people with is know who you're speaking to when you're making your podcast, when you're creating your podcast. One of the things that we did very deliberately was we said, we are going to center an audience of color. That is who we are talking to. We are talking to people of color when we are speaking out into the world, or when we're in our studio by ourselves with the microphone, we're making sure that the people that we imagine listening to us are people of color. That's where we're centering our storytelling. And I think that's really important. Just like know who your audience is and speak directly to them. And they will hear it and they will know that it's for them and they will support whatever it is that you're creating. But I think it's super important to know who your audience is, who you want to be talking to.
I agree with both of our great panelists, and be your authentic self. Lauren has cried. Shereen has shared stories of her background, and people will relate to that. They will. And that would be my message. I want to thank our wonderful panel. Be sure you follow their podcasts. They're terrific, and follow them on social media. Shereen is at Radio Meraji on Twitter. Lauren is at Lauren_Ashley. That's ASHLEE. And I'm at MCurtisNC3 on Twitter. And you can find us all on all of, just look us up. We're out there. And we've been open to communicating with you. There's ways to reach us. And I know we're all always looking for a great story idea. I can say that for sure.
That's right, Mary. That's true. And
yeah, it's been an amazing
open to giving
session.
Advice.
It's at 3:00. We could talk all day and night as far as I'm concerned.
I
and
agree.
For our panelists, I'm going to be, following you and might be reaching out myself. Don't think I'm stalking you. And thank WFAE and our sponsors for making this possible. And if you if you want to recommend it to someone who missed it, this will be available. It was recorded. So thank you all so much for joining in and for your great, great questions. Thanks again.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.